by Debt Collective. We are the nation's first debtors union. I'm so excited today because we're going to have a conversation with someone that I got to meet, Dr. Saudi Garcia, in New York City in person and live. And Dr. Saudi Garcia had so many insightful topics and ideas and insights when we had this feminist analysis of debt conversation. If y'all remember, Vanessa Contreras Capo was actually in our last conversation, and she was one of the speakers at this event. So we're just gathering intelligent, amazing, incredible folks to talk to you today, and in all of the lives from henceforward. So thank you, Saudi, for being here today. But before we start, I definitely have to talk about some of the issues that are happening in the student debt space. So for example, I want to talk a little bit today. We're going to be discussing student debt abolition and abolition more broadly. And one of the reasons we're going to do that is because Debt Collective isn't just interested in canceling all federal student debt just for, just because it will help millions of households. Of course, that's really important. But we also want free college, free medical care, housing for all. We want college that is not just free, but freeing. And it's really important to also understand that abolition is not just the absence of police and prisons and carcerality, but also the presence of the things that do keep our community safe, right? And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. And education is obviously a major, major component of what keeps our community safe. But right now, one of the main campaigns that the higher education team is working on is has to do with the payment pause. So we are right now calling for a pause on all federal student loan payments because the student debt system is broken. The entire system is failing us. In fact, the Trump administration has kind of turned on all the levers of enforcement in terms of payment while simultaneously firing half of the DOE staff. So at this point, people don't know who's managing our loans. Who can we get into contact with for help? Um, who's servicing our, will the Department of Education even exist, right? There's so many questions, and yet people are dealing with all the punishment and all the carceral components of our predatory for-profit and predatory higher education system in general. So we are, because of this administrative incompetence, we are partnering Student Debt Crisis Center for a week of action. This is happening next week. Okay, so please tell as many people as possible. You can actually find out all about this by going to bit.ly/week of action 26. That's bit.ly/week of action 26. If you go there, you'll see all of the different events that we have. And so please come through, invite your friends. This is a really important moment. I'll also add, the last thing I'll say is there's also a bunch of issues happening with Mohila. Surprise, surprise. We've been saying fire Mohila for since 2024 or earlier than that. So there's no surprise there. But today, I want to talk to us because today, or also this week, is what's called Black August. Black August is a really important month for us. It was started actually in the Black American community that were incarcerated, particularly in California prisons. And the idea is to commemorate political prisoners and to talk about abolition more broadly. So that is where this conversation is kind of originating. So I'm going to stop talking in a minute, I promise. But I do have to shout out Dr. Saudi Garcia's expertise. So without further ado, I'm going to explain. Saudi is an Afro-Caribbean queer first-generation immigrant with a deep passion for justice and liberation for her home, the island of Haiti, Dominican Republic, and Haiti, also known as, its people and its diasporas. Grounded in equity, abolitionist, and healing ethics, she expresses that passion through her racial equity work in her community and through her work as program director at Scholars for Justice, for social justice. And remember, as we enter Black August, remember it's a commemoration of Black political prisoners in the United States and beyond. It's really important today that we're talking about abolition. So without further ado, welcome, Dr. Saudi Garcia. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Maddie. I really appreciate it. And I love the Debt Collective. I cannot say that enough. So it's an honor for me to be here with you today.
Thank you so much. We're getting a little bit of delay. If we're having any technical difficulties, let us know in the chat. No worries. We're going to make it work. Hi, Pauline. Thank you for being here. So let's start off the conversation. Again, I was really inspired by your insights when we had our panel, which was a feminist analysis of debt. Um, and I was wondering if you could just talk about your own experience with student debt. How has student debt just shaped the choices you've made, or maybe shaped the way that you interact with your community?
Thank you. So I actually do not have student debt, which is a weird thing to say considering how passionate I am about ending student debt. I was able to attend college on a Pell Grant and a scholarship at my university, my undergraduate university. And I was able to also go to grad school immediately after undergrad. I did a gap year doing service with AmeriCorps in the South Bronx at a public school. And then I started my PhD at NYU. And I was able to actually attend and complete my PhD debt free due to a combination of tuition remission, grants, and a living stipend, plus also working as a teaching assistant for quite a few years. And so by the end of my educational journey, I had a certain amount of debt that was actually paid by an undergraduate program that I did called the Mellon Mays program, which essentially resolved to pay up to $10,000 of student debt. And I was able to complete my program, receive the grant, and then pay off the amount that I had left, which was fairly small. And so even though I have that experience of being so privileged to have been able to have that kind of education, um, and there's a book actually about this called The Privileged Poor, which is about how students from working class families enter and graduate from select prestigious universities and receive the kind of support that I'm talking about. But I also recognize that that is not everybody's story. And through my own political development and political education, and I think especially encountering the debt collective, it opened my eyes to the fact that student debt is a massive weapon. It's something that's holding back generations of students, Gen X students, Gen Z students, millennials, now Gen Alpha. It is a weapon of social control that has been really effectively weaponized against working class people across this country. And so, if I'm in the business of trying to create a more fair and just society, I have to fight against student debt the best that I can to the best of my abilities. So, although I don't have debt, it really shaped my own career and personal trajectory. I was appointed as an assistant professor of anthropology at a university in New York City, a very expensive private university. And over the 2 years that I was there, I grew very disenchanted at seeing how our students' tuition um, just kept going up. And there was such an uncertainty around whether our students would even be able to have jobs after they graduated, and yet tuition was extremely expensive. And so I came to realize how there was a disconnect between my desire to teach and be in a university classroom and the business model of the universities in this country, which it's predominantly a business model of generating as much as possible out of the students through tuition. So I actually changed careers. I decided to leave my role and work to organize the higher ed organizing sector. And that's what I do now at Scholars for Social Justice.
That's amazing. That's incredible because I think people assume that student debt is just something that people that are burdened by the debt itself experience, but your story speaks exactly to the way that debt sends these ripples throughout our community. It affects families, it affects our coworkers, it affects um, just so many people besides just the person that owes the debt itself. And your work really speaks to identifying that and understanding, like, okay, this is something that we have to work on together, and everyone has a role to play, right? Also, what you're talking about, it sounds like, for example, when you talked about debt being a tool of social control, I think that speaks to what we're talking about in terms of this discussion about abolition. right? When we talk about debt abolition at the Debt Collective, it doesn't just mean we want people to be freed from this burdened debt. We know that our politicians have the power. They just lack the political will to do so. And it's actually pretty surprising since, Democrats used to really be spearhead this topic, and now they've often been silent. So, as debtors, we have to push it to the forefront. As allies, we have to push it to the forefront. That being said, I do feel that debt is a discipline. Can you talk about the ways that you notice that your students experience this debt in a disciplinary fashion? For example, I know for me, I've stayed in jobs that were low paid because just with the hopes that maybe I'll qualify for public student loan forgiveness, or I've stayed in jobs that, I was being treated unfairly or poorly because I thought that maybe someday this will help me, get my debt canceled. Are you noticing any things that your students are experiencing because of this unpayable debt?
I'm no longer in the classroom, I'll say that. And when I was at my university, I was a postdoc. So my experiences, I had a very nice 2 year gap of teaching, but I got to interact with so many people in that process. So I would say that the students today are making choices based for their careers and their livelihoods based on the concept that they will have to pay this debt, that they will be saddled with this debt, and that they will have to pay. So I can think of one very general example, which was the boom in computer science degrees in our universities. Computer science, in the past, I would say 15 years, came to be seen as this very, very safe degree that you would get a computer science degree and that would, catapult you immediately into the kind of job that could get you the money you need to pay your debt. And so we saw the uncertainty of that with AI. So now we have these models that can code and be very, successful at, coding. We can get into a whole AI conversation later, but it diminished the value of the computer science degree. Whereas, even, you know, um, students who went to college to become software developers are not landing the kind of work that they thought they were going to land. And so we see that the concern around being able to pay this debt is shaping the majors that students are choosing. And this is not, not new information. This is happening for a very long time. But it also can shape the kind of experience that students are having on campus. And I also have to say that there isn't a prototypical college student or, higher ed student. Many students are getting their degrees at 2 year universities, shorter programs. And so there isn't one sort of story that fits everyone. But there's a general anxiety around choosing the degree, making this big decision that's going to help you offset the kind of debt that folks are getting into because of their degrees.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that kind of is the disciplinary function, which, by the way, I think that there has been an effort over the course of 50 years to make this the case because, as people during the civil rights movement introduced new fields of study, there is this idea that there's worthless and worthwhile degrees. But what you're speaking to is that we all need to
Mhm.
come together because, as working class people, there isn't a lot of job security. Um, and we all need to make sure that we actually, that's why unions are great because that way we have bargaining power and we can fight to make sure that we're actually getting paid livable wages. So thank you for sharing that as well. So I was wondering if we could talk again about the concept of abolition and the term, because we did come up with a working definition of feminism last time. I know it's difficult to define abolition. It's a pretty complex concept. I guess I could start off, and you can let me know. I know that your expertise is in many different areas, but you have colleagues that work. Particularly in the field around abolition, and maybe you have some books that you could recommend. But for me, the way that I define abolition is I do see it as coming from a long arc and history of, freedom from enslavement. My ancestors on my father's side are from Jamaica. Today's Jamaican Independence Day, from Britain, which is great. And one of the things I loved about visiting Jamaica was that we learned about Jamaican history as a series of revolts and uprisings against enslavement, and that abolition was this constant struggle and this constant fight with the North Star. Again, the North Star is such a great metaphor because of the concept of you had to use the North Star, especially in the United States, to get north to freedom, but also with the North Star of saying, like, we want complete and total abolishment of slavery, for example. And so when we use the concept of abolition, where we're talking about student debt or debt that is unjust and related to what should be public goods, we can think of our North Star not just as, okay, we want to pause on all student debt payments. That's a campaign that we're working towards, but ultimately we want all student debt canceled. We also want college for all, and we want that college to not just be free, we want it to be freeing, right? So these demands, as Angela Davis talks about, radical just simply means grasping at the roots. It grasps at the roots of these problems while also keeping that North Star of abolition isn't just the absence of all these disciplinary aspects of our financial system, but it's also the presence of a financial system that actually like helps people and helps our communities be healthy and happy and safe. So those are some of the ways that that's my working definition of abolition. What about for yourself?
Yeah, thank you for that definition and for also grounding us in the history. I think that the Black radical tradition offers so much, and has been documented in so many different ways and so well. So it's always really helpful to try to understand our society through that lens. I think abolition is an evolution of that tradition to
Mhm.
fit our contemporary. I love citing Black as
Oh, Saudi, unfortunately on my end, I'm a little bit of
it,
it's breaking up a little bit.
cite the think this and pine.
Technical difficulties, y'all. One
Hello,
second. Yes, we're having a little bit of
hello.
tech issues on our side where it's kind of breaking up.
Mm,
Is that only for me or folks in the
oh
chat? Are you
no.
also having issues? It's okay. We'll figure it out. I moved to a different place in my house to see if it was.
Okay. Do you think it's me or do you think it's you?
I'm
Oh, I
not
don't know.
sure.
I don't know what's
I need
happening.
the chat. I need some like chat support. Are you all noticing technical issues? Now I'm
Like a
getting
lag?
you're fine on your end.
Okay, this is like an East Coast to West Coast
I know we're
connection
trying
as
our best.
well.
Okay, let's
Yeah.
start.
Well,
Try that again. We were talking about
yeah,
your working
yeah,
definition.
yes. My working definition of abolition. So I was saying that I really like to lean on Black feminists who have written about this topic and really push forward the movement. So one of them is Mariam Kaba, who writes, I am actively working towards abolition, which to her means trying to create the necessary conditions to ensure a world without prisons. So I think that when people hear the word abolition, the word has been politicized in such a way that the meaning of what it is that the idea behind it has really floated away from the actual word. People have taken it to mean like no police, no prisons. Like that is like how the sort of conservative parts of our country have weaponized the word. But behind the meaning is also a sense of creating conditions to ensure that this is not a necessity, right? And I think that that gets completely erased. That gets completely erased from the word abolition, and so that would mean that our entire society would have to shift because in many instances, the kinds of crimes that people are in prison for are related to poverty. And we can actually go into the statistics on what are people in prison for. Um, the US is a country that incarcerates at the highest rate in the world. There are nearly 2 million people in prisons today. And so for Mariam Kaba, abolition is shifting our society to such a degree that incarcerating people, disappearing them from society, is no longer a necessary or is imagined as a necessary thing. So let's talk about Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of abolition, right? Abolition is not only about the absence, so the efforts to dismantle death making institutions, it is also about presence, building life affirming and life enabling communities in their place. That really is touching to me. It reminds me actually of the great event that where we met the Collectives event recently, where the group of feminists from Latin America that was there talked about putting life at the center. And what does society look like when it is not driven by a profit motive, which is capitalism, right? Capitalism's motive is to create as much profit as possible, circulate capital in as many ways as possible to get the max return, right? What does it look like when we actually center a full life and not just a bare life, right? And so for Ruth Wilson Gilmore, abolition again is about creating life affirming spaces, communities, etc. And then finally, for Angela Davis, who's also so well known for writing about abolition, is, her definition thinks about the ways that abolition creates or strives to create a new conceptual terrain for alternatives that will create a radical transformation of many aspects of our society. So we are talking about really dissecting before somebody is in a prison, whether that's state prison, federal prison, whether that is a county jail, before they land there, what are all the things that lead that person down, to eventually be criminalized in such a way to end up losing their freedom? And I really want to use a very personal example. So, for example, I live in the state of New Jersey. In the state of New Jersey, when you receive a traffic violation, you are actually also placed inside of a system that charges you $250 yearly for 3 years for being able to drive in the state of New Jersey. So, say that you receive a ticket. If you can pay your ticket, but you're also going to pay something called a surge charge, which charges you after for the privilege of basically driving in New Jersey, even though you've received a violation. For somebody in this country, $250 is actually a lot. There are many adults in this country that cannot pay for a $400 emergency. And so being charged this extra amount of money creates an impediment. If you don't pay your surge charge, your license is subject to being suspended. If you are caught driving with a suspended license, and there are all kinds of consequences that can come from that, but potentially one of those consequences is actually being imprisoned. And so if someone is put in prison, there's all kinds of mechanisms to make sure that they, don't actually end up having a fair trial. There's that chain of custody extraction that happens, right? The search charge, the court fees, the bail. And if you were a working class or working poor person in this country, it is extremely difficult to this. So I just use that as an example of a real life thing. Like, I am paying a search charge because I got a traffic violation. Okay. So I'm just being honest here. I'm just sharing that as one example of the ways that our current system ensures that at every single point in the road that can lead someone to being incarcerated, there is also extraction that's happening. Um, and so I share that example because it's one example of how entrenched the carceral logic is in our society. I could go out driving right this very second. The neighborhood I live next to is very police. I could get a traffic ticket and end up in the surcharge system again and have to pay even more, right? So there's so many different points at which our system is used, or our systems in life, right, in our society, whether that's the police or the traffic police, or whether that's the school system, even a hospital, um, where there's an effort to move people towards criminalization, or rather to criminalize people and move them along in a path of vulnerability towards where they could potentially end up, which is, a prison, a jail, a detention center, right? We now have 71,000 people in this country in detention centers. Um, and so it just shows you like how much there is to undo. And so the abolitionist logic is not, go shut down every prison right this very second, and that's the only thing that is important. There's also a knowledge and an awareness that there are all these systems that are feeding people into the machine that have to be dismantled communally.
Absolutely. That was such a superb, example, and I really love that you use the lived experience as well, because I love this quote, which is like, "It's expensive to be poor." You know?
Yeah.
We talked earlier before we even got on this call how, also even though, like, I do communications, I do narrative, and even the way that we're conditioned to believe, people that are locked away, that are disappeared, have committed egregious harm, and that's not necessarily the case if we look at the numbers, and a lot of people are incarcerated who have not even been charged of a crime, but they cannot afford bail. That is, if I remember correctly, the majority of people. And so and then it is definitely the majority of people who have been, criminalized for nonviolent, offenses, if not if you so the concept of harm also is an important concept that I think people don't always unpack when we talk about abolition. People also feel afraid, like, "Oh, well, what if if we close all of these prisons, who will be held accountable?" And it's this concept as if people are held accountable now, as if people, some of the richest people and the most powerful people and, now corporations legally are often thought of as people or in the legal sense, treated with some of the rights that human beings should have. And the ways that corporations commit this egregious harm on people's everyday lives. We look at the statistics, around debt, particularly student debt, in terms of it, 1 in 13 student loan borrowers have had suicidal ideation. We look at, how debt leads to, mental and even health challenges for people. We look at how debt disproportionately impacts women and especially women of color, and how forcing people into repayment, that means that they might skip out on meals, they might skip out on paying their rent. If it gets really bad, they might skip out on medical care. And, all of these aspects are part of that harm that sometimes people don't necessarily think about when they're thinking about, the student debt system. They're not necessarily thinking of the harm because it's financial. Um, it doesn't feel as visceral in some ways. And so I was wondering if we could talk about this concept, which I would love to actually write about at another time. But I actually, also to speak a little bit about my own background, I worked with incarcerated youth. I taught poetry to incarcerated youth for 8 years at the San Francisco Juvenile Justice Center. Um, and it was one of the most amazing experiences I ever had because I was able to bring, literacy and emotional intelligence into spaces amongst young people who most of them had experienced going through the foster care system. Um, and what I realized from that is that there's a lot of conditioning that people who have experienced incarceration, they think, "Oh, I've paid a debt to society. Like me being locked up is going to pay a debt to society." And I think if we really unpack that, we realize locking people up, not only does it not keep our community safer because people end up worse off than when they went in there, but also, that's generating money for corporations. Um, that's, giving contracts to private prisons. And so I think that's one thing that people don't always take into account when we talk about abolition. And also why we need to abolish our student debt and get rid of our entire student debt system because of the fact there's all these entities that are making money. I talked about Mohila earlier, and even the concept of student loan servicers. Um, Oftentimes, the right says, well, student debt cancellation costs taxpayers money. Well, the federal government doesn't budget like a household, so that cost factor doesn't actually work that way, first of all. And second of all, it actually costs taxpayers money to service student debt. I say service with quotation marks because, as we know, these student loan servicers are horrible. And no one knows this more than a student debtor that has to
Mhm.
come face to face with them. Mohila, Nelnet, Ed Financial, you name it, they all suck. They're all really bad, and that's why we need a pause on all federal student loan payments. Um, and so, yeah, I don't really have a question. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. No, I think that going back to the one of the first thing you said, being poor is expensive. And I 100% agree with that. And I want to connect that to the education portion. And I want to, and we've already connected it to the incarceration portion, right? Looking at the figures, there's nearly 2 million people incarcerated. There's 546,000 people in local jails, but 426,000 have not been convicted. So they're the folks who cannot get bail and cannot be released from a local jail. So that is an astounding number. Those folks are in prison or in jail because of poverty. Like they just can't pay to leave. So that I think should be a shame. Just is a shameful thing in our society. And then the other million and nine, million or people who are in in state prisons. Some of the crimes that they're in state prison for, they include property crimes, so theft, drug related offenses. And so I name those things because those are also crimes of poverty, right? Like a lot of the drug use in this country is surging from a place of immense despair, immense poverty. And, we have people in prison who also are victims of like the broader poverty matrix of this country. And that poverty matrix has everything to do with corporate theft of our wages. The minimum wage has not risen to keep up with inflation in any way whatsoever. So there's theft, corporate theft happening of our individual personhood, right? When we work at the point of our labor. And then there's also, corporate enrichment happening at the level of the incarceration where they're making money off of everybody in a bed inside of a prison or a jail or anything like that. So at every chain of custody, right, at every point in this, there is corporations that are making money. So you said, where people think, oh, I've paid a debt to society. But what about the debt that's owed to us as workers in society? We are actually owed so much just because of the failure to increase the minimum wage. And thank goodness we've made some progress across the country, increasing the minimum wage in certain states, New York, New Jersey. And it's still not sufficient in 2026 to keep up, right? A $15 minimum wage, bare minimum, to keep up with the cost of living. I live this daily because my mother is a home health aide. She lives with me and her wage is $15, $16 an hour. If we're lucky, she gets an $18 an hour case, but that is pretty rare. And so we are owed, is what I think. And, it should make all of us be pretty pissed, actually, at the government that continues to deregulate industries, deregulate corporations, at a government that continues to empower imprisonment, mass incarceration, imprisonment, and like literal income generation off of bodies who are in prison, right? We should all be pretty upset at that, regardless of how we might feel about like the individual who committed a crime. I think that systemic view, I think that would be the systemic view. And then connecting that to education, right? Being poor being poor is expensive. Um, in this country, like we have already a sense that like if you are black or an immigrant or queer or like a woman, you are somehow less of a citizen, right? And so subjectively speaking, the way for us, these groups of folks that I name, to be able to counteract that is to get an education, right? That was the narrative, right? You go to college, or you go to even community college, you get an associate's, you get a BA, you get some sort of professional or pre-professional degree that's going to enable you to get a better job and hopefully to escape poverty. And but it's not just about escaping poverty, it's about proving your worthiness to be a citizen, to be included, because were able to complete this very hard thing that not everybody in this country is able to do. And so, we have these, increasing rates of college completion, especially among women. Um, but we also have increasing rates of debt and university debt among women. Black women, I believe, hold the largest amount of college debt in the country, like, per capita, or for that group. And so I think that there's something there that's really deep about how our society views us as individuals, and then what we then do to overcome those disadvantages that are projected onto us. And one of those things is certainly going to college and getting that professional degree, becoming part of the professional class if possible, because poverty is expensive, and continuing to live in poverty there are all these potential places where you could fall through the cracks, right? You could be evicted from your housing. You could, end up in the search charge system, like we talked about earlier, or you could, end up in the foster care system for an underage youth. Like, there are all these different ways. There are all these points of failure. And so college was imagined not just in like very mechanical terms of like, oh, you'll get a better job, but there's also something there around like you then get to be included in a different way or viewed in a different way. But then you combine that with the student loan crisis and you get what I think of as predatory inclusion, right? You get to be included in a system where you are going to be extracted from. And that is just the baseline of the token that you will pay for admission, for entry into this other imaginary of the citizen, is literally like your life and death. Um, so I just, this conversation has really made me think about these things and like how they're connected. Um, because there is something that feels cruel about a setup where now more women, more people of color can enter a university only if they're willing to pay, whatever amount, is charged. Whereas before 1970, before the Vietnam War, college was free. Um, and so, yeah, I feel like that I want to just kind of pause there and like let you kind of like think about that and
No,
consider
you
the
hit the nail on the
connections.
head.
By no means am I saying that a prison and a university are the same, but I'm saying that the logics of those both of those structures, both of those systems, unfortunately, is a logic of extraction at any point. Like if you are a young person on a university campus, everything is pay to play, right? Like your housing, gotta pay for that. Your food, gotta pay for that. The crisis at my university where I was so acute that we had a food pantry for our students. And many schools do too. There is a basic needs crisis for our young people. And, not just young people, but there are all kinds of students from non-traditional backgrounds in our schools as well. So there's something there about a system built to profit. The prison system is built for profit, right? It's not built for reform. It's not built for anything like that, right? Changing human beings. That's not what our prison system is set up for. And our universities provide education a cost, right? At every given point, there is extraction that's happening there as well. The textbook costs money, the meal plan, the dorm, all of it. And so I really want to invite us to think about what we're owed. As a worker, or as a human in this society, you spend 4 years, maybe 2 to 4 years in your program, but then you go on to work for another what? If you're 18, you go to work for another. I feel like we're gonna be working till our 70s, Maddie.
I
So
do too.
buckle in, my friend. So, you could be working for another 50 years, right? And paying a lot of money in taxes to the federal government. So the least they could do is make sure we get our education for free. Because now you got a taxpayer making, 6 figures, maybe, who knows, right? Whatever amount, but y'all are getting 25% of that. So why can't I have my college for free? Like, I feel like that feels like a fair trade off. You know what I
Oh,
mean? Like,
absolutely.
like, I'm like, that feels fair. Like, please, like, I will go on to work and produce and whatever, and you will take the tax money, but can I get something? Literally at this critical point, like 18 years old, like the most vulnerable, one of the most vulnerable stages of my life. Like, can I get some support so I can go do what you want me to do? So I think we have to start shifting how we think about this. And, now there's a lot of debate, conversation about democratic socialism in this country. And it's like, Canadians have affordable college and they're not even like, this is the world's greatest economy, right? This is like the world's most productive country. But the Canadians, like, I could drive 8 hours north and they got free college. So, it doesn't feel like, or affordable college, I would say. Um, it doesn't feel like this is something that is such a hard reach. And
Oh, no.
there's some very smart people who have thought about how to make this happen. I think that the reason it hasn't, because it makes sense. Like, the more people who are more highly educated, makes for more, in technical terms, in theoretical terms, would make for more productive workers who earn higher wages that the government can then tax more. So, like, lifetime benefit to the federal government. So it would make sense to make college free. And so you ask yourself, why not? And the why not is that there is a punitive logic there, and there's an extractive logic there that defeats even what is in the best interest of our federal government.
Absolutely. And also, I would argue that, also working within detention centers, seeing people talk about the literacy crisis. We talk about how the majority of Americans read around a sixth grade level, reading level. That affects comprehension, that affects the way that people's media literacy. And in effect, I think that there has been a real divestment from public education, K through, higher education, for the sole purpose to make people susceptible to authoritarianism, susceptible to lack of critical thinking skills and ability to understand nuance and to ask questions of what's happening in our society. And I think we should really, continue to push back against that as much as we can, because, I do feel that education is potentially knowledge, is potentially power, and people shouldn't have to be imprisoned to receive it. I think it's great that we have programs within prisons where folks that are incarcerated can get degrees, but people should be able to get those degrees for free on the outs. They shouldn't have to depend on being incarcerated to get a degree. Um, and the same could be said for their health care and their housing. And unfortunately, I see some of these public goods being, instead turned into these things that are allotted, even though horribly within detention facilities. And so that's a whole nother beast that is also another layer to this issue. And I don't want to take too much more of your time, but I just want to thank you so, so much. For those that are joining, this is Dr. Sadi Garcia, an incredible academic, thinker, activist, person. And I hope this isn't the last time we talk. We definitely have to talk again. This
Mhm.
conversation, we've been having kind of a general opening conversation into abolition because it is Black August. Black August is a commemoration of political prisoners, Black political prisoners in the United States and beyond, and a time to just think about abolition, to study. So definitely take some time to look up the roots of Black August and look up, some of the some of the academics that we talked about during this conversation. Before we get off the call, again, I want to do a really quick update about our event, our week of action that are happening next week. You can go to bit.ly/week of action 26 to find out everything. But to keep it short and sweet, the entire federal student loan system is a dumpster fire by design. We all know this, and yet a lot of our political, electeds are not speaking truth to power right now in the way that they should be. And so we are going to be doing some calls. We're also going to be having events where you can learn about media training and how to write an op-ed, which, by the way, if you would love to come to any of those, or I'll give you some resources
Yeah.
about writing op-eds. Please sign up. Please let as many people as you can know. And yeah, if you have any final words, feel free to say anything you'd like, Dr. Sadi Garcia. But thank you again for joining me today. It's been so amazing talking to you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to chat and make these connections. I think it was an important kind of set of links. And I just want to say solidarity forever.
Oh yeah.
Solidarity forever. And we are making the world, we're remaking the world right now. So it's a very exciting time. And thank you, the collective. Thank you, Maddie. Take care, everybody.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Hi everyone. Bye.
Bye.